Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game Esoteric and a continuing series of Model Museum where I review every single Sega Model 1, Model 2, and Model 3 game that's not an arcade racer, because I already did that retrospective last year. And today we're taking a look at Virtua Fighter 2, which is one of the biggest increases in Virtua Fighter from any one numbered game to the other compared to the Sega Model 1 original version. And we are playing Virtua Fighter 2.1, which has some minor revisions compared to the original 2.0 release, but honestly you could play either and be perfectly happy. But when I say this game was a massive graphical and technical upgrade from the original game, I will put some side-by-side footage so you can compare Model 1 and Model 2 together. Before we get too far involved though, do me a huge favor, go down below and hit like and subscribe and ring that notification bell, definitely helps us out. And if you feel so inclined and want to support the channel, we got a Patreon link down below as well. But without further ado, let's jump right into Virtua Fighter 2.1. And I love the little tiny .1 they put on the title screen. You'd barely know it was a different version of the ROM. But Virtua Fighter 2 is an absolutely epic game, and it still holds up as good today as it did when it came out. But I'm going to say right off the top that I still like Virtua Fighter from 3 on more than I do the original or Virtua Fighter 2. Leave me a comment down below and tell me what your Virtua Fighter favorite pick would be, because I would be curious. I feel like a lot of people are going to be at Virtua Fighter 5, that would be my assumption. But what is on offer here for Virtua Fighter 2 is great, and it is such a fundamental upgrade from the original Virtua Fighter formula. Now, the original game on Model 1 that we've already talked about was revolutionary in the fact that it used 3D graphics, but Virtua Fighter 2 feels like the realized version of what Sega would have done back in the Model 1 days had they had a little bit more power. The roster's expanded, the graphics are so much better, the controls feel a little bit more fluid, and the overall motion and cadence of the fights feel a little bit faster. Because we move over here to the original Virtua Fighter, you can see that the motion's a little bit more staccato, and obviously the graphics are much less refined. But Virtua Fighter, the original game, is fun to play from a curiosity perspective and to see where the franchise came from. But for me personally, it really starts at Virtua Fighter 2 and moves on from there. This is just the classic Sega 3D fighting formula, 3 buttons, very basic to learn, very difficult to master. There are so many different inputs and so many different ways to articulate your character. When you're in a fight, you really need to learn every single function of the buttons as well as the guard, so you can grab, you can grapple, and you can attack your enemy and block their shots. But when we first saw this in arcades, this fully 3D level as we're going down the river and underneath bridges, it was just a sight to behold. We had never seen anything quite like this. And again, if you put it side by side with the original Virtua Fighter, you can just see how big of a technological leap Sega had with the Model 2 hardware compared to the Model 1 original. Because don't forget, these games are not that many years apart, but they are generations removed from one another. The speed, the fluidity, the polygons, the backgrounds, everything about Virtua Fighter 2 is an enhanced spec on the original game from a gameplay perspective and a technical one as well. But the most interesting thing is just how fast technology moved back in the 90s. You would think that 3D like Virtua Fighter the original was the state of the art, and then very quickly Model 2 came out and totally blew the doors in on that. But from a mechanical and gameplay perspective, I love Virtua Fighter 2 because it brings the sensation of speed into the Virtua Fighter franchise. Now, this has never been a game that's going to rival the speed of Tekken in spots, but the original Virtua Fighter was a very slow experience where Virtua Fighter 2 feels like Sega had refined what they were trying to do with the game. Now, I will say that it is not an easy game though. Virtua Fighter 3 on become much easier for me, and for some reason on the Sega Saturn with the same difficulty, I'm able to see the end credits more often than not. With the Model 2 original or Virtua Fighter 2.1, I always have some difficulty around stage 4. That's when the CPU becomes very predictive and seems to know everything you're trying to do and have a counter for that. But of course, this is designed to play with human players. Get a game night together, start playing, you're going to have a great time. And because it is a new release, you get a great roster. A lot of the characters from the original game are back, and you get some new ones as well. But you get to decide what character you mesh with. Someone like Lion here, their cadence and overall weight in the game, I'm never quite sure of how to use, and I'm going to end up beating Lau here with a ring out just by kind of pushing him to the edge of the arena. But I will say, just like the original Virtua Fighter 2 has an absolutely spectacular soundtrack and maybe the best music in the franchise, so go ahead and listen, and I'll be right back.
Fight, dude. Ready, go! Ring out! regularly.
It's just such a great soundtrack, and I do think it might be the best music in the entire Virtua Fighter franchise. Leave me a comment down below and tell me what you think the best music is. But going back to Shun's stage here, where we're traveling downriver with those large mountains in the background, those are 2D objects, but we have this entire 3D bridge that we go underneath that changes the lighting model as we pass by it, and you have all of these incredible shadows for the players as well. Now, I know most people probably have more experience with the Sega Saturn version, so it's interesting to look at just how different they truly are, because if we go over to the same stage on the Saturn, and I have captured this off my real Saturn in RGB off a Japanese console, you can see that that bridge is basically entirely gone. We are stationary and the river is just moving around us. There are so many cuts compared to the Sega Saturn version and the Model 2 version. If you've never played Model 2 and only Saturn, well, mechanically they are as good. Graphically, they are worlds apart. Some stages are more similar, like Lao here. You're going to see that the background, all of those polygonal aspects of those statues in the back have been reduced down to 2D sprites, which doesn't really affect much whatsoever, but the overall gameplay experience is going to be so much better on Model 2, where if you've never checked it out before, you 100% owe it to yourself to do so. Because if you're a Virtua Fighter fan, this is the way to play. But the Sega Saturn version was no slouch either. It did run at 60 frames a second with that interlaced mode back in the day, and it was not at all disappointing. But moving on to selecting different characters, Pi here is closer to who I would normally use. A lot of times I use Sarah as the main, but I wanted to play around with some different characters here as to just give myself more of a challenge. Now you will see there that when the jumps occur, we still have a bit of those moon physics going on. They're nowhere near as bad as the original Virtua Fighter, but you still have a sensation of floating that gets a lot more reduced down when we move over to Virtua Fighter 3, this on the Model 3, obviously more famously known for being on Dreamcast. That's one thing that I've never loved about the Virtua Fighter franchise through the first couple of games, is that insane weird floatiness in the jumps. I've just never understood it, and it really makes me not want to jump much in the game. But moving back to the Model 2, Virtua Fighter 2.1, it is just a beautiful game to look at, and in motion, it is a spectacular game to play. Sega was experimenting with the original Virtua Fighter, and they made a really good game. Virtua Fighter 2 is when Sega and the developers figured out the entire Virtua Fighter formula. They knew what they wanted the game to be, and they knew how to create it. And like I said, it is not an easy experience. For some reason, round 4 is always my sticking point here. No matter what character I use, it's like a 50-50 on that day whether or not I'm going to get by it. I much prefer this game with a human opponent, but of course, playing the Model 2 version, it's not like I have netplay available to me to check out. And in this same generation on Model 2, you have something like Last Bronx, which plays very similar to a Virtua Fighter 2, but it has those jumps that feel at least like they're close to what a normal human being would do. Not a lot of people are doing that high of front flips and kicking in the air, but it feels more like the real world compared to Virtua Fighter, where you really do have that sensation of floating. It takes a little bit of adjusting to get used to if you haven't played this era of Virtua Fighter games, but when you get it down, it's spectacular. Just don't play Tekken or Dead or Alive or Last Bronx before you play Virtua Fighter 2, or else it's going to totally break your brain just based upon that floatiness. But again, it's one of those things. I'm not sure what it is about the arcade version. Leave me a comment down below and tell me if you have any inkling or if you ever read about changes in difficulty. But when I go over to the Sega Saturn version, I am just better at the game. I don't know if it's using the arcade stick for my Saturn versus the arcade stick for my PC, or whether it's not that I'm on emulation with Model 2 versus original hardware for the Saturn version, but I can see the end of the game 9 times out of 10 when I'm on Saturn. When I'm on the arcade version, it's more like 3 times out of 10. I'm really not sure why that happens. But this game is just a classic, even if I was having difficulty with it on this day playing it. This is when Sega finally cracked the code to 3D fighting in their company. Virtua Fighter the original was an incredible game that played around with an entirely new genre, but definitely was not without its faults. Virtua Fighter 2 fixes almost all of those faults and gives you a bigger, better, more beautiful game to look at, and it is an absolute classic and one of the games that's most synonymous with the Model 2. But you leave me a comment down below and tell me what your Virtua Fighter favorite is. I would be curious. I alternate between 3 and 5 sometimes. 4 final tuned, incredible, but 3 team battle, or 5 the newest version are probably where I would land on that spectrum. Sure that I'll have more Sega for you next Wednesday. I'll have videos throughout the week as well, but Virtua Fighter 2 is a must play. Bye bye.